Joe Harper was the kind of man who spoke more through his hands than his mouth. In the small town of Maple Falls, where the days rolled by slow and steady, Joe ran Harper's Auto, a mechanic's shop that had seen better days. The faded signage above his garage creaked every time the wind blew, and the coffee in the waiting room had more rust than the trucks he fixed. But Joe didn't mind. He wasn't in it for the money. He was in it because fixing things gave him peace. The kind that comes when a broken thing finds its way back to wholeness. It was a rainy Tuesday when he saw them. A woman in a worn-out hoodie pushing a rusty, barely moving wheelchair, and in that chair, a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, fragile, silent, but alert. His eyes met Joe's as they struggled across the cracked sidewalk outside the garage. Joe couldn't help but notice one of the wheels on the chair wasn't turning. The rain only made it worse. The poor woman had to lean sideways just to keep the boy from slipping into the street. Joe dropped his wrench. "Mom," he called out. "That thing looks like it's about to fall apart." The woman paused. Her eyes darted from Joe's grease-stained overalls to the boy beside her. "I know," she said softly, "but we don't have the money to fix it." Joe motioned toward the garage. "Bring it in, Theo." That was the boy's name. His mother, Sandra, worked 2 part-time jobs and still barely made rent. The wheelchair was second-hand. No, third-hand maybe. Joe could tell just by the way the bolts stuck, and the bearings groaned when he turned the wheels, but Theo didn't complain. In fact, he watched every move Joe made. "You like tools?" Joe asked. Theo nodded. "Good. Then you're in the right place." Joe worked for hours, not because he had to, but because something about Theo reminded him of someone, his own son Nathan, who had passed away at age 10. Cancer. It had been over a decade, but Joe never quite healed. He just poured his grief into machines. Theo asked questions about the wrench, about the grip of the tire, about why one wheel seemed faster than the other. Joe answered every one. Finally, Joe looked up. "You know, this thing's got more rust than my old Chevy, but I think we can make it fly." Theo smiled, wide and bright. And Joe? He hadn't smiled like that in years. By evening, the chair was better than new. Joe added new wheels, smoothed the suspension, patted the armrests, and even attached a small horn that made Theo giggle every time he pressed it. Sandra tried to offer what little cash she had. Joe waved it off. "You need that more than I do," he said. "Take care of this little guy." They left. Joe watched them disappear down the street, Theo's horn echoing faintly through the rain. He didn't expect to hear from them again. 3 days later, Joe was under a pickup truck, elbow-deep in engine grease, when he heard it. A roar in the sky. Not a plane, a jet. Nobody flew private into Maple Falls. It just wasn't the kind of place for that. Joe wiped his hands, stepped outside, and froze. Descending onto the town's tiny airstrip was a gleaming, white and silver private jet. Within an hour, a black SUV pulled up to Harper's Auto. A sharply dressed man stepped out. Sunglasses, earpiece. He looked like he belonged in a presidential motorcade. "Mr. Joe Harper?" the man asked. Joe blinked. "Yeah, I'm here on behalf of Ms. Evelyn Sinclair. She requests your presence." Joe's brow furrowed. "Who?" "You recently repaired a wheelchair for a boy named Theo." Joe's stomach flipped. "Yeah," he said. "Did something happen?" The man smiled. "Something incredible." The private jet was surreal. Joe sat in a leather armchair softer than his own mattress back home, staring out at clouds that looked like cotton. Then she walked in, elegant, mid-50s, platinum gray hair tied into a bun. Her presence was magnetic. "Mr. Harper," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for taking care of my grandson." Joe stood. Theo's your grandson, she nodded. My daughter Sandra chose a quiet life away from all this, she said, gesturing around the lavish cabin. She didn't want Theo growing up with the pressure of the Sinclair name. Joe couldn't believe it. Evelyn Sinclair, the founder of Sinclair Robotics, worth billions. I owe you a debt, she said. You didn't just fix a wheelchair. You gave my grandson independence. You restored his spirit. Joe, flustered, mumbled, It was just a fix. Nothing big. Evelyn's eyes narrowed gently. To you, maybe. But to him, it was everything. She slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a check. $250,000. Joe choked. Ma'am, I can't take this. You must. Or I'll double it just to prove how serious I am, she smiled. But that wasn't all. I want to fund a new garage, she added. Not just for cars, for wheelchairs, for prosthetics, for kids like Theo. You have the hands of a mechanic and the heart of a healer. Let's build something that lasts. 6 months later, the ribbon-cutting ceremony drew people from across the state. Harper Mobility Center stood where the old gas station used to be. Inside, it had the best tools, clean floors, a wheelchair testing track, and a mentorship program for young mechanics. Theo cut the ribbon himself, now zooming confidently in a custom titanium-framed chair designed by Joe. Sandra cried, Joe cried, everyone cried, and the town of Maple Falls, it changed because kindness became contagious. Years passed. Joe trained dozens of kids, some disabled, some from troubled homes, some just needing a direction. All of them left changed. One of those kids, Theo. By 18, he was building mobility gear that doctors across the country were using in hospitals. By 25, he became a partner in Joe's business, expanding it into 10 cities, and every time he told his story, he started it the same way. It all began when a mechanic fixed my wheelchair for free. The wrench Joe used that day, he framed it, not because it was rare, but because, in the right hands, a simple tool can change everything.